Despite international diplomatic and military efforts, the wars in Syria and Yemen grind on. At a recent meeting in Doha, the so-called Doha Forum, many of those involved in efforts to find a peaceful resolution gathered to reflect on the lack of progress. One of them, the head of the venerable Munich Security Conference, spread his message that the European powers in particular had failed miserably.
The Western policy towards Syria, it seems now it's focused more on combating certain groups and perhaps limiting the Iranian presence in Syria rather than the overall political future, investing in the overall, or investing diplomacy in the overall political future of Syria, which is left more to the Russians. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, quite frankly, I'll be very honest with you. I think our Syria policy has been a disaster. We, the Europeans, we started 7 years ago with the loud call for the demise of Bashar Assad, without really having a plan of how we would want to get rid of him. And of course we didn't get rid of him because we never had the means and the strategy and the policy to influence decisions on the ground. So now what we're now seeing is the outcome of efforts by Russia, by Turkey, I guess by Iran, and to a certain extent by the United States, with Europe having been on the sidelines throughout this process. That is extremely regrettable. This is why I'm saying, and I repeat, Europe must try to defend and represent the interests of 500 million Europeans. The refugees didn't go to Moscow. They didn't go to Pennsylvania Avenue. They came to Europe. These events of the last 3 years have changed European and German politics in a major way, almost dramatic changes. The migration pressure, the refugee problem. So this is really our issue, and we should have played a role, a much stronger diplomatic role. I think the EU should have started a peace process 5 years ago or 6 years ago, instead of looking the other way. So this was not a beautiful example of great European diplomacy. I'm very self-critical on that score.
Also at the Doha Forum were the leading officials at the United Nations in charge of humanitarian affairs. Mark Lowcock, the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs, and Henrietta Fore, CEO of UNICEF, the Children's Emergency Fund. We sat down with both of them to discuss the situation at hand in Yemen and Syria. We began with Yemen.
Mark Lowcock, welcome to Al Jazeera. You're just back from Yemen. What was the glimpse of the country that you got?
Well, what I saw was a country on the brink of a terrible, terrible tragedy. Talked to lots of people who've had to flee their homes from the fighting, parents of starving children, really a place that is right on the edge. And we've got the good news from Sweden. The parties have agreed initial steps to de-escalate the conflict and to try and move things forward. But that now needs to be translated into a real change on the ground, because the people I listened to, the parents of starving children, people who fled from their homes, sometimes multiple times, they are not seeing yet any tangible benefit.
How do you avoid complacency? Not so much obviously and clearly for the people on the ground, the people who've suffered for 4 years now, but the people that were in Rimbo in Sweden. How do you maintain the pressure on them to come up with something? Because I guess the message from the people of Yemen is, we're tired, we're exhausted, this has got to stop.
That's exactly the message. Those are the words the people of Yemen I met said to me. They're desperate, exhausted, sick, starving. The single message to the world that they sent, as I told the Security Council, this war has to stop. So the message to all those who went to Geneva, to Rimbo, as you say, is words are great. The actions now need to follow to implement your commitments, especially, very importantly, around Hodeidah, where there has been an agreement that that crucial port city through which so much of the food eaten in Yemen comes in, and the mills and the roads through which it gets to people, they all need to be protected. And the ceasefire that was promised for Hodeidah, that really needs to come into operation straight away.
Would it be fair to say, however, for your people on the ground, even for aid workers, if you unpack the numbers of Yemen, the numbers that break down Yemen, they are shocking. When you're talking about how many people are literally on the verge of death, when you talk about cholera, when you talk about that sense of catastrophe that's just around the corner.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've just published the results of the biggest ever survey of food security in Yemen, and what it shows is that at the highest level of food insecurity, the catastrophe level, for the first time there are people in that level in Yemen, 250,000 of them. There's only one other place in the world where there's anybody at that level of food insecurity, and that's South Sudan, but there are 10 times as many people in Yemen at that catastrophe level. So reaching them is absolutely a first priority. The stories my colleagues tell me of what they're seeing on the ground, what I've seen for myself, seeing starving children in hospitals, all the evidence is clear. This is a really big problem and we need to scale up our assistance. Now the peace agreement, the first steps that have been taken should help us with that, but we need some other things as well. We need all the parties on the ground to make it easier for the aid workers to get to the most vulnerable people. We need to pump more money into the economy. We do need to ask for more money for our appeal, the UN appeal. Last year we asked for $2 billion. This year we needed $3 billion, and we've got most of that. Next year though we need $4 billion, because what's happened during the course of 2018 is that millions more people have become vulnerable.
When you come to run those operations where the situation is getting worse, not better, are you kind of, from a humanitarian aid point of view, kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul? Because around the world now we've got 70 million people externally and internally displaced who are running away from conflict. And you've got a bigger problem coming, which is this, that for the first time in the history of your department at the United Nations, can I suggest to you that you're having to tip from doing just keeping people fed and watered to doing a lot more than that?
We're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. This year we've raised a record amount of money, even bigger than last year's money that we raised for humanitarian response. About $15 billion, I think, were raised by the end of 2018 for the UN coordinated programs. And the gap between the money we're asking for and the money we're raising is in fact getting smaller. So it's a positive story that countries around the world recognize that investing in reducing the suffering of people in humanitarian crises is a very cheap way to save a life and also build stability. But we do have to work more closely, to the second part of your question, with those organisations, including other parts of the United Nations, which are involved in finding the peace-building opportunities, the political solutions, the development and so on, because while humanitarian aid is very effective at saving lives, it doesn't on its own contribute to the solutions. And if we want to reduce the number of people whose lives are so terribly ruined by these crises, we have to do better on solutions.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is here, you're putting three things together. You're doing what you do better, you're doing it faster, you're doing it with a sense of being innovative. But those three things, even if you triangulate those in a very efficient way, by definition almost, they're going to reach critical mass at some point. You can only go so far. You can only slice the salami to make it go further than it's going to go anyway. At that point, what do you do next?
Well, at that point, you need solutions to the underlying problems. We need more examples of successful peace discussions of the sort we had in Rimbo in Sweden for Yemen. We need that to happen in other places. We then need to stabilise the situation. There's 70 million people displaced by these crises. We need to see millions of them going home.
I realise that this probably doesn't come within your mandate, but you have to, the UN has to be able to say, you're talking about Yemen a lot, to the warring sides and also the proxy warring sides in a situation that we've seen in Yemen for 4 years now, and say actually, and explain to them, peace, in inverted commas, is in your strategic interest. So you can still get what you want or what your people on the ground tell you they need because we're kind of correlating two things here, and you need to get that message, you need to break it down and get it across to the warring sides.
Exactly right. No one has won from this war in Yemen. It's absolutely clear who the losers are, though, and they are the starving millions of children and women and innocent civilians whose pictures increasingly we see in our newspapers and on our TV screens. Those people have a good understanding of who they think is responsible. So it's in everybody's interest for those people to have more hope for the future, for them to have a glimpse of possible progress, for grievances to be addressed, for anger to be reduced, and for lives to be recovered. That is a strategic interest for all the parties who think they've got a stake in Yemen, as well as a humanitarian imperative.
One slightly worrying aspect that came out of the conversations in Rimbo, apart from the photo opportunities and the handshakes, and your colleague Mr. Griffiths, who's done a tremendously energetic job to get them where he got them, and he played an absolute blinder with the prisoner release, which was his calling card on day one of those discussions. Is anyone at the United Nations not talking to those people who are representing the fighters, but talking to the people who talk to the people who talk to the proxies? Because there were serious worries raised, for example, over one particular aspect. You can get peace on the ground, but if there are still fighter jets coming across the border from the neighbor to Yemen, Saudi Arabia, game over, and it just goes back to where it was before.
Well, the United Nations talks to everybody and anybody who has a stake in this, and I think there is a recognition that there needs to be a de-escalation on all sides, and that is part of what has been agreed to take forward from Rimbo. Lots of the parties actually were around the table and in the vicinity of the talks in Rimbo, so we are hopeful that everybody recognises that now is the moment to move forward and to consolidate the first steps that were taken in Sweden.
The wars in Yemen and Syria have lasted so long that an entire generation of children are missing basic education and nourishment. This is where the UNICEF, against very difficult odds, steps in. Henrietta Fore is the CEO of UNICEF.
According to statistics, half of Syrian children, that's more than 4 million children, have known nothing other than war. You're talking about 2 million who are out of school. What is it that UNICEF is doing for them?
Well, you're absolutely right. There has been a very strong toll on the civilians in Syria, and the children bear the brunt of it. So with those numbers, that many children that are out of school, 2 million of them, if you think of what happens in a child's life, if they miss a year at school, they might miss adding or subtraction. They might miss learning to read. It's a very long period of time for children. So UNICEF works in nutrition, in health, in education, in water, sanitation and protection, all of the areas of a child's life. There are, as you know, many internally displaced people within Syria. And there are more than 2 million children that are internally displaced and more than 2 million children that are outside, that are refugees. If you add that to the number that are out of school, and if you add in those who are exposed to explosive remnants of war, it's a very difficult and challenging time for children. They need education, they need safe places to play, safe places to live, they need nutrition, and they need clean water. But it's a very, very difficult time in Syria.
It's not just the issue of relief and protection today. I mean, the psychological scars that will haunt these children in the future when, if this war ends, it's difficult to comprehend. I remember visiting an orphanage on the border, with Turkish-Syria border, and we were speaking to some of the children there, and from, those who couldn't sleep to those who were, in their teens and were still wetting their beds, and really things that were just going to live with them for the rest of their lives. So is there a scope in your work to look at what happens once the guns go silent?
Yes, and you are right. The children are deeply affected by violence of any sort. So whether the violence is because of war or because of conflict in their community or because of violence at home or violence online, there are deep scars on a child internally that we cannot see. So some of the children that we saw that were in schools, some were terrified because they'd seen too much. They'd seen killing and maiming. They'd lost people in their family. It could be a father, a mother, a brother, a sister. It will never leave them. So they're scared, they're afraid to make friends. Others are exhibiting the opposite type of behavior. They're more violent with their classmates. They've seen it on the streets. They think it's now how they should react to one another.
But I mean, looking further to the future, is there some sort of plan put into place in terms of emergency response or war response that is almost second nature to you guys? But looking forward to it, what would you do for that?
Next.
Yes.
Right. So what we do now is we help with bringing textbooks into schools. We help with getting children into school, at reintegrating them into a school community. So there is a new curriculum that we've just launched, which allows children that have been out of school for 6 months or 6 years to come back into school and to be reintegrated into school. We also have simple information at schools, like how to detect a mine. There's lots of explosive fragments still on the ground. They're pretty and children will want to play with them. But if you can stay safe and you can tell your classmates how to stay safe, that makes a difference. So these kinds of programs help. We also have been helping training community leaders and teachers, school systems, how that will work and how you can reintegrate. There are lots and lots of internally displaced children and young people in Syria. And as they begin to move and head back into communities, they also need reintegration into their home communities because their homes have changed. Their friends aren't there, the community does not look the same. We walked through one area, which is Duma and Ust-Ghouta. It's been heavily bombed, and so there's much rubble. It's difficult to go back to your homes. It's been looted from all furniture. The schools have been looted. The schools are overcrowded because the children that are coming back were expecting to go to schools, but only half are open, so they have to take in more. Water becomes a daily activity, so you have to go find clean water. There isn't clean running water anymore. You have to go find food. So children are not just going to school, but they're trying to cope with an everyday life, and their families are struggling.
There's another major war in the region, and that's the war in Yemen. According to statistics, there 20 million people are living in hunger. Children are dying as a result of cholera, a disease that should not be killing people in this day and age and with the technology and resources that exists. Are you able to reach those who are most in need in Yemen? Is there any hindrance to your work there? There was closure of ports, there was places under siege and so forth. But how is UNICEF's operations with regards to Yemen?
So access in Yemen is always a problem. And there's another problem, which it also shares with Syria, which is the humanitarian workers are often targeted, or they're seen as being just anyone. Well, if we're not safe, we're not a military, so if we're not protected when we go in to do, let's say, a vaccination program, something that will help cholera, a clean water program, it makes it very difficult to reach the hardest to reach, that are up in the mountains, that are difficult, isolated populations.
Has that targeting been by the Houthi militia or by the Saudi-led coalition, or?
By all sides. But as you know, cholera has been a real problem. So is malnutrition. When I went into the main hospital in Sana'a, it was clear that there were just dozens and dozens of people that were coming in every hour looking for ways to feed their children. I mean, they're dehydrated, they are starving, they are coming in. There are very few pharmaceuticals and drugs to help. And if you happen to be born at this time period, you are lucky if you can find a hospital that is able to take you in and help with the birth of a child. In many places, they're losing electricity. Electricity is what allows you to pump water so that in surgery units that you're able to wash your hands. And it's just the basics, but those of us who live in non-war-like situations take all of this for granted, and it just cannot be. Yemen is the largest humanitarian crisis that we have.
When it comes to children, particularly in Yemen, they have really faced the brunt of the war there. We saw a school bus being bombed by the Saudi-led military alliance a few months back, and we've seen children, as you've mentioned, die in the hundreds because of malnutrition and other diseases. Why is it, do you think, that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the two countries mainly leading this coalition, why do you think they haven't done enough to protect children in this conflict?
In every conflict around the world, none of us are doing enough. There are more grave violations against children and their rights at this time than there ever have been at any time. Conflicts, there are so many now. There are more than we've ever had. They are of longer lasting and they're more severe. That takes an enormous toll on children. So none of us are protecting children well enough.